Productive Pastor 78, 3 types of ministry weeks. What's going on, friends? Chad back here, Productive Pastor 78. Oh, this is getting deep into the sods. But it's great to have you back here on the podcast. Thanks for jumping in. Thanks for letting me into your ears yet again. We're going to talk about 3 different types of ministry weeks, something that I've experienced a lot and I'm actually experiencing this week. That's why the episode's a day late. Before we jump into that, I want to let you know one thing. We're coming up at the end of the year. It's November. So many pastors are thinking about what their goals are for the next year. Maybe they're looking at their education accounts, that sort of stuff, and realizing, hey, I want to be able to go to the next level in some way, shape, or form. And working one-on-one with pastors in a coaching relationship is one of my favorite parts of my vocational ministry right now. In the show notes, revchadbrooks.com/PPP/078 is a link to working with Chad. I would love to have a free 30-minute exploratory conversation with you about what your goals are, what it might mean for us to work together in an action-focused and deliberate coaching relationship, and just to take care of some things, to think through some things, to help you strategize, to help you grow. I've got so many different things that I do one-on-one with pastors, and I would love for you to be part of that. I take on a handful of folks every few months and would love to save a space for you. So click that link if you want to get that exploratory call, have a conversation about what it might look like to do that together. So that's the front matter. I'm ready to jump into this content to talk about these different ministry weeks that we have. And it's kind of like I told you earlier on, this was one of those really, really busy weeks where I had to make some decisions about what was going on. And I realized ultimately I'm going to push the podcast back one day further in the week than I normally do, because this is still like a one-man shop here, y'all. Like, there's not anybody besides, I don't want to say little old Chad. I've never been accused of being little in my life, but it's just Chad sitting here in the office at the desk that takes care of this entire thing. And I realized there were some priorities I had, and the priority I had that y'all got bumped for, I hate to tell you, was cooking dinner for the people I work with. And I decided that's the priority that I have right now, because we don't live in the same town. We very rarely get to be together in that sort of a setting. So I was like, I'm going to push the podcast back one day, release this episode, get those final things bumped off. So here, 3 types of ministry weeks. Weeks are never the same. Each week is different. Ministry is different. We say all the time, ministry is a responsive job. Ministry is adaptable. We cannot anticipate every single thing that comes to us. But I have found that we can get 80% there 80% of the time. And this is the big question I want to ask you this episode about this is this. What if we thought deliberately through what a handful of weeks that seem to repeat themselves over and over, what might that look like? You see, I've learned how to live through this strategy over the last several years, probably 5 years, and have not get overwhelmed, but also to learn to be highly adaptable in whatever situation is going on and proactive regardless of what gets thrown at me. And I think that, 80% of the time, there are 3 types of weeks we will deal with. Okay, number 1 is the normal week. Number 2 is the absolutely crazy week. And then number 3 is the really light week. A normal week, a crazy week, and a really light week. And before we jump into this, one thing is going to be the same in all of these weeks. And what that is, I call it the bare minimum schedule. Now, these are the things that have to happen every single week, regardless of what is going on. Your administration, your preaching, your leadership, this sorts of thing. And if you've never dug down into what a week needs to look like for you in this kind of bare minimum schedule way, this is the time to do it. As I said in episode 10 of the podcast, there's a link to that in the show notes. The more predictable, the more purposeful. You never want to go into your week with an absolute complete blank calendar, because it will always be bad. So think about this. What is the basic framework for a handful of things? Number 1, what's the basic framework for your sermon preparation? Now, if you don't have a framework for sermon prep, if you don't have a rhythm you normally go through, it's going to make things so much easier to begin developing that rather than sitting down with a blank page and sitting down to have no plan each week. You think through, this is what Monday looks like in my sermon preparation. This is what Tuesday looks. You get the drill. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Having a very distinctive rhythm that also matches the stages of your sermon preparation. So that basic framework for sermon preparation is the key to kind of leaning into this. The more you're able to hone in on creating this personal framework for you, the better you will be able to be responsive when things get wild. It's kind of like jazz music, though. Like, you go through the reps, you play the scales, you play the modes, then you go off paper when you can or when you need to go off paper, but then you know how to get back on being on paper. That framework is going to be everything. The second thing is, what is the frameworks for your deep work? And I really like to say this. What are the 2 non-negotiable times of the week that you need for deep work? And I would say these things are only broken for funerals and absolute total emergencies that might lead to a funeral. I've said this before. You need to defend these just 2 non-negotiable times for deep work. Defend them like helms deep. Like this, it needs to be just priority one. Number one, you just know I've got 2 times of the week that I can buckle down. I can shut the door. I know how to get myself into deep work mode, and I do this, and people know this. Like, this is on my schedule. The folks I work with know this. This is not a secret, private thing. What are those 2 non-negotiable times you need for deep work? The next thing is have an understanding of your tiny, huge tasks. I talk about tiny, huge tasks all the time. Tiny, huge tasks is a tiny little thing that has huge results. I use Trello for my weekly dashboard, and my tiny, huge tasks are plugged in Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. No matter what, just nothing can get in the way. I know those things, if I take care of them, I will have made significant traction that day because they're tiny little things that get things done in huge ways. They're there no matter what. So thinking through these things, that's going to give you that bare minimum schedule. Your framework for sermon preparation, how you understand that looks like. Your 2 non-negotiable blocks for deep work. And then an understanding of your tiny, huge tasks. Those 3 things right there will give you that bare minimum schedule. So let's talk first about normal weeks. So what happens when you have a normal ministry week? The cool thing is you get to define normal. For me right now in my role, because I'm bivocational, I've got 4 different types of ministry that I do. My normal is very different from what my normal was for 15 years when I was in a local church full time. For me, my normal means I'm not traveling and I have no morning calls scheduled. I let morning calls come in only for emergencies and like super ultra priorities. So nope, I'm not traveling. No morning calls are scheduled. That means I am here at my house from Monday through Thursday. I get my deep work time. I get my sermon prep time. I get my development time. That's what my mornings are devoted to. I can go over to the little church I pastor, sometime during the week to check on things, that sort of stuff, all that. That means also I do max 3 coaching calls a day on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So 9 a week is my max. That's all I can handle. My scheduler app manages that for me. It does not let them get booked on top of each other. It gives me a break in between calls, and it also does not let more than 3 calls get scheduled a day. And so I use that for so many things for people that I need to have a conversation with. So that's kind of what that looks like. That's that normal week. I know what this is. So then what we can do is put in all of your weekly meetings, the times that you have regularly scheduled. Do you have staff meeting every week? Do you have one-on-ones? This kind of stuff, like the weekly meetings that are there every single week. That's going to define your normal week. Thankfully, right now, I do not have those. You think through, when do you spend time in your sermon preparation? I told you, it takes me 6 to 8 hours a week now because of my situation and context. But for a long time, it took me 20 or 25 hours a week. So your normal week is where you spend your time in sermon preparation and those meetings, because the goal here is to understand how much discretionary time that you have available. It's not to create as much discretionary time, but it's to understand how much discretionary time you have available. And this means how many hours are not taken up with regularly scheduled things such as meetings and other conversations and your sermon preparation time. This helps you understand what you are saying yes to, but this also helps you understand how much time you have available for longer projects. did episode a while back. I'll have the link in the show notes, but I talk about, doing 80% productivity. And what the ideal is that you do not need to have your schedule more than 80% full. It's giving you a solid one entire workday a week available for responsiveness and for what things happen. And it's just kind of planned and scheduled there. Ideally, I think what your normal week should allow you to have a 30% margin or so. So what that means is that, you have at least 10% more time, which is, if you think about it, in ministry, 5 days a week, you've got morning blocks and evening blocks, or morning blocks and afternoon blocks, that sort of a piece. So if you're scheduling to, 30% margin, what that means is you have 10% of your work week, which is either an entire afternoon or an entire morning block that's dedicated to long-term projects or things that are going to be stretched out over several weeks. And you have the flexibility of an entire day to think through. So like if you schedule schedule yourself to 80% and nothing falls on top of your lap that you have to go crazy for, you now have a day and a half of the entire week that you can devote back to whatever you think you need to. If you think, hey, I want to get further ahead on sermon preparation, or we've got a capital campaign coming up, or something that really needs your focus and attention. If you're scheduling to 80%, you're saying, hey, this is going to be a normal week. There's nothing wild and crazy on here. And so I should have at least 10% margin going on. And so unless anything crazy happens, I can spend a decent amount of time thinking forward and thinking more towards stuff. So, that's what this normal week could look like. Realistically, what that means is you have 3.5 days of work scheduled. And then you have an additional day and a half where you have margin for other things. So the normal week. Let's talk about the light week, because sometimes we have light ministry weeks. And what's wild is you can also plan these. You can try to stick these in, and I think it's healthy to try to get one of these every 6 weeks, couple of months. But, light ministry weeks, it might be a Sunday that you are not preaching. If you only don't preach on Sundays, you are gone and out of town. You need to work on fixing that, developing some other folks, that sort of stuff. So a light ministry week could be, a week where you're not preaching. Sometimes there's just certain times of the year. Episode 8 of the podcast, I talked about the quarter and how ministry has seasons and cycles. And sometimes we're just in a season and cycle where things are really, really chill and light. And it's going to be different for everyone based off of what your roles and responsibilities are. But, you might sometimes just have a light week. You might still even be preaching, but so many other things are not happening and taking place. I think a light week is what happens when you don't have things taking up more than 50% of your schedule. So if you think back to the plan we're thinking through 5 days, that means that you have at least 50% discretionary time for the week. It goes back to that idea of the bare minimum schedule, because I think you'll find out the bare minimum schedule is actually a lot more minimum than you realize it is, especially when you have an understanding of what it takes to do things, which we're going to talk about later on in the episode. This is also fluid. Also, things change here, but this is what happens when you have 2.5 days of work, and then you have another 2.5 days that are not scheduled. There's not something hard and fast on the schedule. So what do you do here? What do you do on those light weeks? Now, sometimes I think you need to intentionally plan these or take advantage of them to doing these long-range plans. Or you do deep work to make things smoother. You realize, hey, this summer is a super chill time. We don't do Bible studies. Our committee meetings roll to once a quarter. Like, we eliminate a lot of non-essential administrative stuff, that sort of a thing. So you know what? I'm going to take my time and we're going to write that staff handbook that we've always wanted to do. Or I am in school and I'm going to focus really, really hard on my schoolwork, or I'm going to do major projects for the church. I'm going to plan and prep this out. Have an idea of some larger projects that can be backburnered until you have light weeks. So that's one option. But the other option is this. If it's light and it's been busy, I would just declare it as light and take a break. Sabbath a little extra. Something I learned from the clergy retreat I was on this week and had my work friends here at the house with me is this: enjoy the fat and the sweet, as it says in Scripture, and just rest a little bit. Sometimes light weeks are blessings from the grace of God, and we should take them. The last week that we're going to talk about is what I call the different week. I realize I don't like the language of the absolute crazy week because, it might not necessarily be crazy, but the different week can mean a bunch of different things. It can mean like my week was this week where you're just out of the office for a couple of days. I had a day and a half of a clergy retreat with other colleagues, and I knew one of those evenings my team I work with was going to be at the house for dinner, that kind of, and it was also the middle of the week, which is when I do a lot of deep things. And so there's an example of a different week right there. It could be an emergency. You could have a funeral or the type of things that happen in ministry where we have to just automatically drop everything and be responsive and be highly responsive for a few moments. You could be sick. Like you could have just gotten a cold and you're knocked out for a couple of days. They're just things and just weeks sometimes that happen where you end up realizing I'm having a different week, because this tracks back to our idea of work being about percentages. And so let's say that this is a week where you have less than 50% of your time actually available to you. So if we're thinking about this 5 days, 10 work blocks, what that means is at least 2.5 days worth of work blocks are not there. Now, sometimes if the right day is taken away, it can throw me off. If my Wednesday is taken away, it's going to be a really, really different week. But when you find yourself in a situation where you have half of the time to do your usual work week, in which I tell you, schedule for 80%, your discretionary time is blown. You're actually having to work hard towards getting everything actually done without eating into Sabbath time and weekend time, which is sacred, friends. It needs to be sacred. It has to be sacred. So what happens in those weeks like this? When I have those weeks, like this week, and I'm cramming for a whole work week, including sermon preparation, into a couple of days or 2.5 days, usually this means I'm traveling, which happens a lot for work now. But this is what ends up happening. I'm going to focus on the sermon because every week I got to do the sermon. Every week I get the podcast out. I write a newsletter the week. I have other responsibilities. I have administration stuff. I have church stuff to take care of. I've got, managing my coaching load, the administration that's behind that, all this other kind of stuff. Like that is my whole work week. And sometimes I have to cram that into 2 days. So how many times a month can you have a week like this? Because this is when people start getting tired, is when they realize they're having a couple of 3 of these a month, or they're starting to chain them together. This is where it can be really exhausting. This is where you have to have an understanding of how do I approach the different week. Now, first of all, if this week is expected, plan for it. I'm going to call this the weeks where you come back from vacation. Have you ever, ministry folks, have you ever come back from vacation on like a Tuesday or a Wednesday and know you have to preach on Sunday? Don't do it. Don't do it. Find somebody else to preach or have the sermon done earlier. Like you don't want to do that. If you can expect it, plan for it. The next thing is this: offload unnecessary tasks to the next week. This is where my Trello dashboard comes in so clutch, because every one of my tasks is sitting there as a card, and I can literally move it to a list that says for next week. And I can just say, hey, I'm going to do it next week. I'm going to focus and prioritize it then, but I'm going to give myself permission to not get that thing done this week because it's not absolutely 100% essential. Think about what meetings can be canceled, or what meetings can sometimes, if it can't be canceled, can someone else take over leadership? So you just literally get to walk in, be there, and then walk out. But then the next side of this is like, what meetings actually need to be weekly? And I really think if you think about it, you can realize that sometimes, especially if you know that not just you is going to have a crazy week, but everybody else in the church office might have a crazy week. So say there's a funeral. I worked at a church one time. If we had a death, it derailed the entire staff for at least a day. So cancel staff meeting. Say if it's absolutely essential, send it to me an email or come knock on my door. Cancel the meeting. The key here is to make sure that you have time to complete those absolute essentials that you've identified earlier, to complete those things without losing your mind. That's the key. And you cannot do this unless you do the work and do the time to think and know what is your bare minimum. So a couple of things, if you want to think about this, you need to think about this maybe. Number one is the time audit. Y'all, I talk about the time audit all the time. It's episode 2 of the podcast. Build up the idea of how long it takes for you to do things. This is a superpower. People don't realize. I know now I can write a sermon in 6 to 8 hours. I know that I can create a Bible study and teach it in 2 hours. I know that I can handle, it's a full load, but I can handle 9 coaching calls a week, and I can schedule around that reality even when I'm on the road. I know that it takes me 30 hours to develop a custom workshop. The Trello course, I was learning this as I was doing it, and I think I could probably trim it down now, but I could probably trim it down even better after I've done it 3 or 4 times. But I'll tell you, and I've been thinking about, I don't want to do this again. I want to get myself into this booger. It took me 8 hours to develop, 80. It took me 80 hours to develop the Trello course. It was 20 hours a module. So I know now this is a solid 2 weeks of work that needs to get stretched out across at least 10 weeks because I have my bare minimum schedule. I have an awareness of how much time I can devote to this sort of thing. So know how long it takes you to do things. There's a resource. I'll have a link to it in the show notes. There's a time audit worksheet that I have. It's been downloaded thousands of times in the last 10 years. And I do a new version of it like once a year. So you can grab the latest version of it. Just go to the show notes, revchadbrooks.com/PPP/078. Get that time audit worksheet. Like, this is key. This is key. Second thing is this: know your non-negotiables, but manage to those non-negotiables. For me, I manage this in that Trello dashboard. I teach people how to do this in the Trello course, but it keeps me in gear. It is highly flexible. It is the key to every single thing, as I have multiple irons in the fire because it's so adaptable and it's so responsive. So know your non-negotiables and have them declared. Don't just like, I need to prioritize that. No, have it written down and have it to be something that you have to check off every single week. So you have that just built into you, that this is your non-negotiable. So many of your non-negotiables go back to your bare minimum week. Grasping those 2 concepts, friends, will help you so much learn to navigate whatever ministry week gets thrown at you. And we want to be better pastors. We want to be responsive. We want to be able to do all these things, but we also want to stay healthy mentally, spiritually, emotionally, with our families, with our churches, with our friends, all these things. One of the best ways to do that is just to simply be able to take control of what our weekly schedule looks like, no matter what's in it. So think through these 3 weeks. And I love that idea of just understanding this and how much discretionary time do I have available. Normal weeks, I've got 30% of my time is available. Light weeks, it's 50% of my time is available. On a different week, you might only have 30 to 40% of your time available. And so you need to really, take care of what matters most. The best way to do all this is just begin to have an understanding of what has to happen and how long does it take me to do it. And that's where productivity then comes in, is how can I find ways to get around this? How can I find ways to do this more effectively? How can I find ways to create more margin so different things can exist? So thanks so much for tuning in this episode of the Productive Pastor. If you want to talk about coaching, there's a link in the show notes. Go hit it up. I would love to talk with you about what that might look like in your life. But hope you have a great day, and I will see y'all back in the next episode.